Welcome to a new wave of entrepreneurship. I'm Scott Sturt, founder and CEO of Venture for Canada, and your host. The focus of this podcast is to hear from changemakers and young Canadian entrepreneurs to learn about how they've developed their entrepreneurial mindset and skills. In Season 2, we'll be chatting with young Canadians about their unconventional career trajectories and what it's like to be young entrepreneurial leaders. I'm excited to dive into these conversations about how to foster your entrepreneurial mindset and drive. Nico DiPlacido is a 2016 Venture for Canada alumni and a product manager at PartnerStack, where he's helping make it easier for anyone in the world to sell software. Nico joined PartnerStack shortly after the founding team graduated from Y Combinator in the fall of 2015 and has helped scale the business from 6 to 120 employees. Nico is active in the Toronto product community, co-hosting a product workshop with CS in Focus, as well as mentoring those looking to break into product management. Nico currently lives in Toronto and holds a BA in Media, Information, and Technoculture from the University of Western Ontario. How are you doing today, Nico?
Doing great. Thanks for having me on, Scott.
Thanks so much for coming on the show today. It's a pleasure to chat with you. And kind of diving in, relating to like the last point in your bio, you're a graduate of the Media, Information, and Technoculture program at Western. And I've always been fascinated. It's a super unique program, and I think one that a lot of people don't necessarily know a huge amount about. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about the program, and what were some of your key learnings from participating in the program?
Yeah, absolutely. So the MIT program is a favorite, I think, of sort of career counselors in the GTA. There are just so many when there's sort of uncertainty or where students are looking at, business or communication. They point them a lot to Western, this MIT program. And so it's Media, Information, and Technoculture. The program popped up in 2000. Really some media theorists came together and they're like, we need to start educating, the youth and create a world of study around how technology is changing everything. And so it's a tricky thing to describe, but I've kind of settled on that. Really, it's studying the theories and principles of how technology has influenced human behavior and organization. So what does that mean? People think of tech, how social media or different things are impacting how individuals see themselves, how individuals see each other, and how we kind of come together as a society, or Western society in this case. But it's not always tech with a capital T, right? We don't think phones or the internet or USB or whatever that is. It's also, roadways. How did that impact, how humans move from place to place? The creation of pavement, the cars, airplanes, all of these different things that we start to understand. How are these things, for better or worse, impacting how we're organizing as human beings? So, when we think about how someone's university education impacts their career, it's not as straightforward as you might get with something like computer science or engineering, where you're applying those skills directly. The MIT program is interesting in that it's actually quite critical of the institution that it lives within, of sort of for-profit universities in many cases, and is frankly quite critical of STEM in that they're looking a lot about how the masses have organized like their labor power. We start to look at kind of like socialist theory, really, and how that labor power is being exploited just to train youth to go and work out in the market. And so really what I've taken from the MIT program, and I guess their byline, is not teaching you like what to think, but rather like how to think, or a framework in which you might be able to critique and perceive the world. There's this joke within MIT that after you graduate, or even halfway through the program, you become insufferable to watch TV or commercials or movies with, because you can point out all of the little critiques and nuances that are the underlying messages within all of these different things. So it offers you a really interesting framework to kind of critique the world and see different angles at things, which is in a way like the core of entrepreneurship, and if depending how you look at it.
That's a great overview of the program. Speaking on the topic of frameworks,
Yeah.
what are some of the key frameworks that you learned from the program, and what are some examples of how you've applied them in your day-to-day life?
Yeah, so tactically, the program itself is a ton of writing. They're essay courses, and there's a lot of discussion and sort of time with TAs and in smaller group setting, arguing different points. And so through that, and there's a writing course that you can take, and it was called Technical Writing. And it was just a phenomenal course. And I think back to that course and even review the textbook probably like once or twice a quarter. And I picked up a writing framework that I use for almost absolutely everything when it comes to even presentations, emails, even partially on the conversation we're having right now. And it's called the Minto method. And it's really boils down to situation, complication, question, and answer. And so you're setting first off the situation, anchoring the reader or the viewer and what it is that we're talking about. But then there's a complication. So what's the problem, right? We're always talking about some sort of problem or there's a hill to overcome, right? So once you outline the complication in the current situation, it begs a question, right? So situation, we're all living in the world, it's great. Complication, now there's a dragon about to attack the town. And so question is, how do we save the town from the dragon? And then you can outline the different answers that you have to solve the complication. And it kind of ties back nicely to this idea of the hero's journey that is really, really common in fiction and kind of how we understand stories and media and TV. And so I plucked that out of there, and not always verbatim, but you can use that like four-piece framework to just inform at a high level how you're thinking through and communicating problems. The communication of problems is the number one thing I've taken out of my entire university education, really from an academic standpoint.
What do you think are some pitfalls that people fall into sometimes in describing problems?
The classic, and this is a product management pitfall and is probably the first lesson you really need to learn in product management. I know we'll talk about that later, but you become very solutions focused. And so instead of really deeply understanding and firming up what the problem is, you start to think directly towards a solution. And once you become solutions minded, it's very hard to see outside of that solution, that the sort of A to B approach. And so really deeply understanding the problem before you get to the solution is absolutely probably the number one pitfall when dealing, starting to look at and tackle a problem. The second, and I mentioned this because there's so much talk now and focus on data-driven decisions. We want numbers, we want, objective or be objective as possible before we make decisions. I would look at the backing of that data. There's a great book, I think it's How to Lie with Statistics. It's short, a highly valuable read. I think you can read it in an hour or two, but just out, and I think it's old at this point, so it stood the test of time. It's I think from the 80s or 90s maybe, or maybe earlier. But really, really be careful if you're making a data-driven decision that you understand the methods in which that data was gathered. Are you interpreting that data in a way that's to your benefit or to match a hypothesis that you already have? Be highly skeptical of yourself. There's a great quote by Richard Feynman where it's you mustn't fool yourself and you're the easiest person to fool. And I think about that all the time, about how, even though I try to be impartial, I do have, skin in the game, usually with a decision. And so you got to be careful not to fool yourself and to look for data that already affirms, or is a bias that's affirming your already previously held beliefs. So that's two things to keep in mind when it comes to problems, for sure.
Agreed. Our brain, I think a lot of times people think that their brains are irrational, but our minds are anything but. As Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel Prize winner, has written about, there's over 150 different cognitive distortions that our mind falls into, and it's in many ways our mind is constantly playing tricks on us and even even a perception of reality, each person has different cognitive, filters, and it can get very meta sometimes when to think about it. But I agree. I think in the case of data, it's really easy to convince yourself into a bad decision. A great book I recommend to people on how really smart people can make really bad decisions is The Best and the Brightest by David Halberstam, which is all about how the United States got into the Vietnam War. And it was JFK, and it was Robert McNamara, who was this Harvard wonderkind that was the youngest ever president of the Ford Motor Company, who was the most data-oriented person like ever. He would be considered today like a data geek, like somebody who's just like obsessed with data. But ultimately, in the case of the Vietnam War, the data was telling him a story he wanted to. You can always, particularly if you want a certain outcome, you can always get the data that you want to justify it.
Yeah, it leads into of course there's a name for all these different principles, but and maybe you know this, but when a measure becomes a metric, it no longer becomes a good measure, right? When you give someone a target to hit, and they can just manipulate the execution to hit that number rather than the underlying target, which I think you talked a little bit about with on the previous episode with Chris Grouchy I was listening to when it came to sales calls. But yeah, just don't fool yourself, and that's a lot easier said than done in many cases. Yeah.
Yeah, it's very easy. And beyond business, also just in life, it is very easy to convince yourself of things. One thing I find, someone told me this piece of advice a long time ago, and it stuck, is that if you ever have to convince yourself of something deeply, it's probably not a good decision, because you're just trying to justify it in your own mind. But on the topic of metrics, you're a senior product manager at PartnerStack. A few different kind of questions related to your job is, can you talk a little bit about what does a product manager do? I think some people obviously know a lot about it, but for people who are just entering into tech space, it's sometimes a job that people don't know a huge amount about. And then what are some of the main metrics or key performance indicators that product managers are regularly assessed on or accountable for?
Yeah, absolutely. So product management is really about understanding the problems and pains of your users, and outlining those and prioritizing those. So understanding the problem deeply, being problem obsessed with what are those pains and problems that your users are experiencing in their jobs, and then prioritizing those in an order. You can't do everything, and you can't do everything at the same time. And so it comes down to, number one, understanding problems and prioritizing those problems. Now, product managers, and this is a great breakdown, and I steal this from our Chief Product Officer, Daniel Shapiro at PartnerStack. And really, a lot of product managers really wear three hats. Number one is just a normal product manager, so that PM, and that's about the prioritization, understanding the users, and that kind of world. The second is product owner, which is really in that agile Scrum manifesto. A lot of organizations run Scrum, which is really just 2-week intervals, put your head down and iteratively deliver upon a problem, generally in 2 to 3 week intervals with an engineering team. And the product owner's job is to work more tactically with the engineers and designers to prioritize the backlog and kind of the release schedule of when the solutions to the problems are coming out. And then third is the product marketer, which is also now a very common role that we're seeing, especially in software companies, where your job, you've identified the problems as a PM, you've helped build them or like organize the build process as a product owner. Now, as a product marketer, you're thinking about, how am I enabling our users to use this feature? How am I enabling the organization that I work in to sell and to support and to upsell around this feature set to ensure its adoption and it's used in the most successful way? So a lot of PMs are really a mixture of those three hats. As organizations grow, there's often postings you can find at Amazon or Microsoft for just a product owner or just a product marketer. So people get more niche focused as they work in larger organizations. But a lot of the roles for product managers I've seen in Toronto and in the US and in general, really they'll balance between those three hats. And some weeks you'll wear all the PM hat, other weeks you'll wear all the PO hat, but it really bounces around between those three. And I like that because if you're going into a product management role or you're talking to an interviewer or you're in an interview context, you can kind of get a gauge on which one of those three the role most focuses on, and kind of divvy up your time or interest depending on which role you're most interested in if you're going for that. A lot of people want to be product managers now. It's kind of exploded on the scene. There was recently a report sort of as a community in Toronto, I think it's called the Toronto Product People, and the founder of that puts out a report every year kind of polling the masses, and the numbers of people who have grown in that community and the job openings for product managers in Toronto have just like quintupled over the last few years, and you kind of see that on job boards as well. And I think it's difficult, like people are really unsure about how to get into product management. And a part of that report I just mentioned found that a lot of people there's not really direct entry paths into product management, or there didn't used to be. A lot of the time, people are joining into a product organization from other roles like support or success or sales, really understanding the user space and then having an interest in a product role and making the jump across. Now we're seeing things like the APM program, which is the Associate Product Management Program. I know that there's a Toronto location. I think there might be a Valley or a Bay Area location as well now. And that's like a very junior level product position, which is probably new in the last 3 or 4 years, maybe in 5 years, as a direct entry outside of school, or people just entering the job market. So it's easier to become a product manager than ever. There's more roles, but I think with that, there's also a lot of misunderstanding as to what the role really entails. Yeah.
Agreed. There's a lot of 22-year-olds who I've met over the years who everybody wants to be a product manager. Unfortunately, not that many often want to be sales or into customer success sometimes. And I find it's interesting because so many 22-year-olds want this kind of amorphous product role. And often there's a lack of understanding about what people in product actually do by sometimes people when they graduate, which is why I think your answer was super helpful at really demystifying and breaking down what product managers actually do on a day-to-day basis. But also within your answer, I think you talked a little bit about some of the challenges that it's not in contrast to sales, someone enters as like a sales development representative, they become a business development representative, they become an account executive. There's a really structured career path. While they launch a program like APM and there's more of a path for junior product people, historically, there haven't been as many entry level opportunities. And even in general, in a company, I remember someone once describing, if you have a company of 100 people, there might be in general 5 people in product or less sometimes, relatively kind of small. So it is pretty challenging for a recent grad to break into the field. I guess a question that I have for you, Nico, is if you're giving advice to like a 22-year-old who's just graduating from school and is dead set on product and actually knows what product is and is a good fit, what advice would you give to them on how to break into the field?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say if you can find a junior product position, absolutely, I am all for it. You should go for it and go through that. What I think there is perhaps more a better path, frankly, is the existing path, and that's finding a company that you are very interested in the space, you think it's growing, you like the team, it fits all the other components of somewhere that you'd want to work, right? And look for a role in support, in success, in sales, in any of these areas where you can really deeply understand their product, their market, and like the problems of their users. You will be frontline on at sort of the well rather than the jug of the information and the pain of what these users are experiencing. And something that I give this advice to a number of people with this exact question is during the interview process, be very candid that you're looking to get into product as an end state for you, and what opportunities are there within that organization you're talking to move horizontally or into the product organization from the support and success role. I think being really candid and generally good companies will also be candid about that opportunity to move within the organization. You will learn so much more about the customers and problems working with them day to day than you will as a product manager out of the gate. So I think that both can be good, but there is nothing better than really deeply understanding the user problems that a company is facing. And I can speak to this myself. I think it's important that people like take their own advice. The only reason that I consider myself a half decent product manager is because I spent so much time at PartnerStack in the early days doing all of the customer facing work, support, sales, integrations, success, sort of account upgrading and maintenance. All of that has given me huge amounts of context to the pain that they feel for working with partners that then informs all of my product management work, not vice versa. So I think there's a massive opportunity at the outset of your career to really understand the users of a certain company, or even just in general, before jumping into product management. Yeah.
That advice makes so much sense to me. In essence, it's so important to get your hands dirty sometimes in seeing all the different parts of a company. And I'd say maybe building on what you're saying is, it seems like a product manager, it's incredibly important to have a kind of cross-functional expertise and be able to work cross-functionally across a company. And if someone has only worked in product, it probably is challenging to put yourself into the shoes of people in other kinds of roles, or to potentially work as effectively in a cross-functional way. Do you think, is that another benefit of the career advice that you just provided?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a saying in product management that I think I'm butchering right now, but you have to lead with influence and not with title. As a product manager, you're trying to influence the actions of your development team and your designers to get towards a certain goal, but you're not their direct manager, you're not their boss. And so you need to have some sort of, kinship and respect from them to drive the team forward. As a product manager, I think it's important to note you're not doing any of the actual work. You don't own the solution generally. And this varies from company to company, but I'll speak generally. The product manager does not own the solution. The product manager owns the problem space and the prioritization in which those problems are solved. The engineering team, the developers, and the designers on the UX side, they develop the solution. And of course, it's a three-sided pyramid, right? You've got design, you've got engineering, and then the product side is generally the business side, but it's also the glue that's kind of driving towards the KPIs. So that's really important. I liken it to, in a military context, the officer that's never been to war. And you see this kind of trope in a whole bunch of kind of military, reenactor history movies, where you've got, the leader of the troops, but they have far less experience than, all of the people that they're supposed to be managing and leading on the sort of boots on ground soldier side. So there's some likeness there, in that doing your time in the trenches, to follow the analogy, builds so much trust and respect within the team. So it absolutely helps, and it will only help your sort of product management career.
Agreed. It's sometimes good to take a non-linear career path and to try a lot of different things, particularly when someone's at the beginning of their career, rather than being, I think, too dead set on one path from the outset.
Absolutely.
Going back to PartnerStack, is, as mentioned in the bio, you were the 6th employee, and now there's over 120 employees. And I think one of the things that people don't consider when they're choosing to join a company is the extent to which job applicants are also interviewing a company, in the sense that a company is obviously interviewing job applicants. So when you were a recent grad and you were considering different kind of companies to work at, why did you choose PartnerStack, and what was that potential you saw that the company could grow to where it is today?
I love that. And I'll just repeat it back, that the candidate is interviewing the company as much as the company is interviewing the candidate. Everybody forgets that, especially at the outset of their career, and people have interviewed for years. It removes so much, I feel like judgment. People feel like they're on a panel to be judged. It's a conversation two ways, right? To understand if they're a good fit for you as much as you're a good fit for them. So I just want to echo that. When it came to PartnerStack, I was coming out of school. I tried to start a few companies and worked on with a family friend on a company that was essentially building streaming software for sports. The software would clip up the videos and you'd share it out so that athletes could be recruited and whatnot. So I had a little bit of an entrepreneurial kick, and I was looking to really join an enterprise that had some backing already. And I, earmarked 2 years for myself, saying that I want to go work at a startup, do or die. No matter what happens, we're going to sign on for 2 years and ride the ship, through heavy seas, whatever. So, I was kind of doing the rounds. Venture for Canada was helping a whole bunch with that. And through my sort of entrepreneurship work at Western, the guy named Ian Hayes, who ran at the time the Entrepreneurship Center at Western, reached out after I put Venture for Canada in my LinkedIn bio and said, "Hey, Nico, I know these guys coming back from Y Combinator. They went to Western as well. They're looking to make their first business side hire. Are you interested in getting an introduction?" I said, "That'd be great." So I got an email with Bryn, the CEO, and we were called Grow Sumo at the time. And so after about 10 days, we went back and forth with some emails and met them in person, and they gave me a job offer. And so one of the things that really interested me about Grow Sumo, or now PartnerStack, is it fit that like my number one criteria for what I think makes a successful company. And I was trying before I hopped on here to attribute this back to someone. I think it was Paul Graham, but really it comes down to you need someone who can build a product really well and someone who can sell a product really well. And speaking with Bryn and Luke, two of the four co-founders of PartnerStack, so there's two on the business side, and then Neil and John on the development side. They were just incredible at selling their vision to me. I knew nothing really about the partnership space or affiliates or referrals or resellers or anything like that. And I just felt their passion, leak through the phone. I was absolutely floored. And I had a few other offers, and they went above and beyond to connect me with other individuals that, had known them and could kind of further validate the experience that I had with them as well. So given that they fit that bill, and I liked that they had backing from Y Combinator, which I knew a ton about, and then Real Ventures was already invested from a seed stage here in Canada. So sort of the framework was there. It fit, which kind of de-risked it in a little bit. This wasn't a couple guys working out of their garage, not really any users, very little external validation. I was able to find, kind of fell backwards into it. But those two things, the external validation really from like reputable sources, and the founder's story and like competency that they sold me on and willingness to go above and beyond, really sold it for me. Yeah.
As an anecdote for our listeners, as I remember, the 2016 Venture for Canada holiday party was hosted at the then Grow Sumo / Ada Support shared office. And it's pretty remarkable because the two companies at the time probably cumulatively had, between the two companies, maybe 15 employees. And they were in this little office in near Spadina and King, I think, or Spadina and Richmond. And we were all, there's probably 50, 60 Venture for Canada fellows and partners and things in this office in Toronto. And I remember it was packed. It was a pretty small office. And today, across these two companies, they employ probably over 300 people and have both been phenomenally successful. And considering how the vast majority of startups at that stage fail and certainly do not reach the size of PartnerStack and Ada, it is super impressive to see where the companies have gone. And Nico clearly did a really good job of picking a company that is a rocket ship. I recommend our listeners check out a great commencement speech that Sheryl Sandberg gave at Harvard Business School, where she talks about, if you're offered a seat on a rocket ship, get on the rocket ship. And I think it's such a important piece of advice that the learning that someone can get in a high growth environment. In the case of Sheryl Sandberg, not only did she join Facebook at a relatively early stage in an executive role, she actually was a really early stage employee at Google beforehand. So she kind of has joined two rocket ship companies in different kinds of ways. So on this topic, Nico, is what do you think are some of the key learnings that someone gets? And I mean, an experience that you've had of being in a company that's grown so rapidly over the course of a couple of years. But those also on the flip side, what are some of the biggest challenges that in particular recent grads will face working in such a hyper growth environment?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, I always think about that Christmas, the holiday party there. Just a funny thing about Ada joining our office is that Mike and Dave Hariri and Mike Murchison, who's the CEO at Ada, they were just looking for office space. They'd wrapped up their previous company, and there was just two of them in our office. They sat like right behind me, just two desks, and I think we had a couple employees at that point. So there was maybe 8 of us, and they closed their seed round, and or maybe their Series A at that point, I'm not sure, but they went from 2 to like 25 people in like a matter of weeks, and we're like, okay, it's getting pretty crowded in here, you guys got to move out. And that was a few weeks after the Christmas party. But yeah, just good memories I hadn't thought of in a little while. But yeah, for early those early in their career joining a startup, you're going to wear a lot of hats, a lot of hats. I used to describe it, and really still do, as a group project. It felt like a really serious group project out of school. We were spending so much time together. It felt a lot less like a job than it did just a project to push this boulder forward every day from whichever angle it needed to be pushed from. There's an internal joke at PartnerStack with some of the sort of original crew, is we had this 100 email thread with one of our customers who's still a customer today. And if you scroll back through the thread, you see my email signature change like 20 times as the role changed on a week-to-week basis, between sales and support and success, integrations and data. And so I think it's the flexibility to take on, like, understand the problem, take on the challenge, and don't be afraid. Well, number one, you're gonna have to learn new things that you don't know already, and being really transparent and honest when you don't know how to do something, but you can say to yourself and your team, hey, I'm gonna learn this thing, right? We're gonna solve this. I'm gonna have to learn some new stuff, and we can figure it out. And that that sort of culture of honesty and transparency is super, super important with a new company. I'm very bullish, and this is really coming from our CEO of Bryn Jones, who's done a phenomenal job all the way through with this, is being transparent about where the company is financially. Or if you're joining a startup, you should ask them how much runway do you have? Or for the uninitiated, essentially, if we make no more sales and get no more money, when does this company die? Right? When are we done? And so understanding, the burn rate and understanding what runway you have as a business is really important as a early, sub 10, or even like sub 30 employee, depending on what business you're in. So I think just, flexibility is the name of the game. Being, what's the word I'm looking for? Vulnerable, and that, hey, I don't know these things, but I'm going to try to learn it. It is really, really important. When it comes to like being successful in some of these roles, I always fall back to a framework that Dan DeBow, who's now the VP product at Shopify, I checked today, actually spoke to us about, I think, the commencement for our 2016 Venture for Canada class. And it's this idea of being a general purpose smart person, or like how to be helpful at a startup, at an early stage startup. And he's got a great blog post that maybe you can put in the show notes of this. But I completely forgot he spoke to us about this, but I recommend it all the time. And so really it's a 5-stage pyramid. The base is essentially you are identifying a problem and you tell your boss about it, right? Super basic. It's like the lowest level of help. Identify problem, tell people. And as you move up, you start to take on more ownership, more understanding, and eventually solve that problem yourself, such that the top is you identify the problem, you figured out the cause for that problem, you researched some different areas and methods to solve the problem, and then you yourself or a team of people that you brought together solve that problem and close the book on it, and then you tell your boss, right? So when it comes to, if I have 2 employees and I'm the CEO of a company, imagine that difference. People coming to me with problems versus coming to me saying, hey, there was this problem. Here's what the issue was. Here's what we thought about. Here's what we did to solve it. And here are the results. Like, phenomenal, like completely different. And that actually had a very like tactical material input to how I interacted with PartnerStack as an employee at the time. So highly recommend everyone give that post a read. It is my #1 most shared resource with students coming out of school. I absolutely love it. It's so simple.
It is an amazing blog post, and I definitely really highly recommend that people check it out. Dane is an amazing thinker. We actually had him speak virtually to the newest cohort of Venture for Canada Fellows very recently. And he has been a huge supporter of Venture for Canada in many different ways, including as a donor, as a volunteer, and just as an amazing, I think one of the smartest people in the Canadian tech ecosystem, and a very multidisciplinary thinker. So his blog post is one of the best things, I think, for, in particular, a recent guy. But I also think it's helpful for pretty much anyone in their career, because one of the most frustrating people to work with, particularly if they report into you, are the people who just come with problems all the time and they don't come with solutions. And it's great advice for anybody at any point in their career. One of the things we were talking about before the show in the kind of sort of pre-tape segment is the importance of mental health during the pandemic, and just the importance of, I think, normalizing conversations around mental health. And one of the things that I've known about you since we've probably first met like 5 or 6 years ago is you are a very competitive athlete, and you are a long distance athlete. You are Strava themed. You definitely, it's very impressive at the level of or distance that you're able to do, and just your discipline in your long distance athletics. So a few different kind of queries on this topic. The first is, what attracts you to long distance sports, and what is your kind of path to getting into this space? And then the second thing that I'd love to kind of talk a little bit more about is, in what way do you feel hobbies and in particular kind of exercise or athletic hobbies can be really helpful for supporting and fostering positive mental health?
Absolutely. Yeah. So so thank you. Really pumping me up on that. So I grew up playing sports, every sport under the sun, predominantly hockey, soccer, and football, but mainly hockey at a pretty competitive level. And once I went to Western for university, I completely lost out on all my competitive stuff. It was all gone. I went from everything to nothing. And I realized how important that was to absolutely my mental health, but also just who I was as a person. And so previously, like during my hockey career, one of my coaches did the Ironman in Florida. And during our Christmas season, it was like, where's Coach Steve this week? And we found out, oh, he's training right now for the Ironman, in Florida. And I was like, oh, what's that? I was like 7, and looked into it, and was just, I thought it was such an interesting challenge to see, what limits kind of the body could go to, and if I could kind of hold up on that level. And so at that point, I think I was in like maybe grade 4 or 5 at that point. I was like, before I'm 20, I am going to do an Ironman. And so fast forward to first year, and I was thinking to myself, I need a new competitive edge. And, how the years go by, I realized, well, I'm turning 20 next year. I had this sort of goal with myself. I guess I have to do it this year. It's the last year I can do it. So kind of got everything together and went after this like goal of an Ironman, which is like a 4-kilometer swim. It's a triathlon, so swim, bike, run. It's like a 4-kilometer swim, 180-kilometer bike, and then a marathon, which is 42.2-kilometer run. I'd never really swam before. I had a pool in my backyard growing up, but not serious swimming. I don't think I'd ever swam more than 50 meters in my entire life up until that point. So learning how to swim was a really interesting, like, what was a challenge you went through? Like, that's how I answer that question, is teaching myself to swim as a 19-year-old, essentially. Very, very, a 9-year-old can swim faster than me because it has nothing to do with strength. It has everything to do with efficiency and not fighting the water. And that was really interesting for me. And, what attracted me to this endurance stuff was really just the mental challenge of, can I go this far? What are the limits of the human, mind and body, and especially like mine, how far can I go? I see these other people doing it, why not me? And so that's a big motivator for me. I think when it comes to what I've like learned from endurance sports, like I've done a couple ultras now, I've done some like longer bike rides, I've done another Ironman since. Really, it comes down to like meditation time, frankly. I really don't like running, which people don't believe. I don't like find that much enjoyment from it. But funny enough, of all places, I saw a TikTok of this girl who was saying it was a competitive collegiate cross country runner at a D1 school in the States. And, she was kind of responding to someone says like, why do people run? Why on earth would you run? And it was so simple. She's like, it is the most mindless, like exercising daydream you can imagine. And I was like, that's completely true. When I go for a run, I really don't think about anything after the first 5 minutes. And it is just free exercise time where I can just daydream and like meditate with as blank a mind as possible. That's been a huge like meditative bonus for me. Plus all the benefits of the exercise and whatnot is fun as well. So like from a mental standpoint, I've gained so much from it in terms of just mental health. And I can tell obviously when I have not been exercising as much as I normally would for a period of time, I notice it in my sleep, in my focus, and in tons of different subjective to me, but absolutely has a huge impact upon my life. I have like one quote I go back to for all running and all endurance things, and it comes from an ultra runner, super like Wayne Gretzky level ultra runner, the man, the myth, the legend kind of thing. His name's Dave Horton, and he has this phrase where it's like, it never always gets worse. Right? It never always gets worse. And so, people run a 5K or they run a marathon and they go, okay, 5K, cool. Oh, marathon, a little bit harder. That's cool. And then you say, oh, I ran an ultra. And they go like, what? That must be awful. Because if a 5K is this bad, a 10K must be like twice as bad. Or if a marathon is this bad, an 80K run or a 60K run must be twice as bad. Well, it's not always the case. Right? Any runner will tell you at the 10K mark, you might have a stitch, you might be completely beaten down. But if you remember, it never always gets worse. By 30K, sometimes you feel like completely fresh. And so you keep that in mind. And I keep that in mind with life as well. When there's like sales issues or anything else, it never always gets worse. There is eventually an end to everything. And that is like the number one sort of mantra or thing that I keep in mind, that there's an end in sight. It may not be in sight right now, but you have to remember that it exists. So that's been a massive takeaway for me from that, all my endurance experience.
My own experience, I'm not as intense of a runner as yourself. I've definitely not done ultra, but I've done half marathon level. And I just started last summer, and not in a formal like half marathon, just like I did my own half marathon because of COVID. But your experience runs true, is that after 10 kilometers or 12 kilometers, you can feel tired. And then sometimes at 18, 19, it's just, it is this, I experienced it the first time last summer when I ran, I think it was probably 25, 26 kilometers. And you just start to, especially at that end, it's like incredibly meditative. Like you just, your energy is gone and you're just, pushing. And sometimes I feel like I definitely want to run a marathon one day, because I can totally see what you're saying. You just kind of get in this almost trance-like state and you're just going. And, there's sometimes a sense of, oh, I'll just go until my body drops, or until, the day ends. there's few things as therapeutic as running. I generally have not liked running outside during the winter, but this pandemic was the first time that forced myself, that I was even in January and February out there running. And for any listeners who are in Canada that do not like winter running, I would now say winter running can also be incredibly cathartic, in some ways even more so than in the summer because of the cold weather.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's a saying that you run the first half of an ultra with your body, the second half with your heart, which sometimes holds true, but it especially the longer distances, your ability to push through and play mental tricks with yourself and kind of set a goal and say, I am going to continue on from this, whether I got to crawl, run, or walk, is so almost one-to-one true with like the entrepreneurship kind of journey, in that you have to set your mind on something and almost everything is against you, every hill, every stick in the road, but the willingness to put your head down and run through a wall essentially is like just holds true constantly when it comes to rejection or problems. So it's just been such a nice parallel between my sort of hobby stuff on the endurance side and then my experience with growing PartnerStack over the last few years.
Yeah, the analogy between long distance athletics and entrepreneurship is definitely very relevant. And I'd say there's one line I saw on Twitter many years ago that stuck with me, where a person said that entrepreneurship isn't a marathon and it's not a sprint. It's a marathon punctuated by sprints. And I think that line definitely stuck with me as well.
Absolutely.
On the kind of closing note, one of the things that we're a big fan of at Venture for Canada, and there's a constant question in many of these podcast episodes, is around books and lifelong learning. So what are 3 of your favorite books and why do you recommend them?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first is Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. Very commonly, I think recommended. It's certainly not like a hidden gem. It's like the gem. But for that reason, I feel like still a lot of people haven't read it. I read this book for the first time, I think I was like 19 or 20. And I've never read a book where I felt like it'd been a mistake for me to wait so long to read it. Been like, I would have been a better person if I read this 5, 6, 7 years prior. And so I try to reread that like once a year as much as possible. And if you're not familiar, it's essentially about his time as a prisoner in the concentration camps, interned by the Nazis during World War II. And he's a trained psychotherapist. And so essentially, through all of the adversity and just adversary isn't the right word for it, just absolute, just unspeakable horror that was, in front of him trying to find meaning and purpose in his life, and sort of the journey that he took through there. It's just an absolutely remarkable book. It's not overly long. It is perfectly does what it needs to do. And I highly, highly recommend that before anything else. The second is called On Writing Well, which is by William Zinsser, I think. And essentially it's very much like Strunk and White, which is the elements of style, but far more approachable and a little bit more modern than that. And so it's just a phenomenal book when it comes to communicating, especially now when so much of your communication is digital, whether that's cold outreach, but even on Slack, making it so that people can read things once and bring your voice through and personality. It's a phenomenal read. Again, very it's nonfiction, it's tactical, and it's not as I find pompous or academic or elitist as I feel like some other grammar, punctuation, or style guides tend to be. Very, very approachable book on writing well. Highly, highly recommended. On the fiction side, I love this book. It's called A Confederacy of Dunces by John Kennedy Toole. It's about this guy named Ignatius, who is just this, he went to college and he's in the French Quarter in New Orleans, and he thinks he's better than everyone else, and he just kind of stumbles through life. And it's just a comedy of errors, essentially. The writing is fantastic, but also, unfortunately, the the book was published posthumously, or is that the right word? After the author died, essentially, and he took his own life because he couldn't get the book published. And now it's an absolutely like legendary book that has all these accolades to it. Highly, highly recommend the book itself, but also the foreword for that book by another author is just a phenomenal kind of juxtaposition between the message of the book, but also what the actual author went through in his personal life trying to get the book published. Is the whole thing just fits really nicely together, and I highly recommend it. This isn't really a book. I just wanted to hit 3, but all of the essays by Paul Graham you can find online. And I just the amount of value and insight in those essays by Paul Graham, there's a lot of them, there's about 100, but I think the 3 key ones, or 3 of the most important ones, are up top, and they're not overly long, usually like 100 or 500 words. Take a look through them, see if any of the titles of them stick out. The essays by Paul Graham are just absolutely a goldmine of insights from a startup, entrepreneurship, and just life perspective. Writes a lot about, parenthood and whatnot. So highly recommend those as well, outside of a physical book.
Also, +1 to Paul Graham essays. In particular, one I recently reread was Maker's Schedule, Manager's Schedule, which is a great one about the importance of blocking time and how meetings can be very disruptive for creative work. And he has dozens, as Nico said, 100 plus of different essays, and they're very short, very digestible to read. Also, +1 on Viktor Frankl, and Man Search for Meaning. I read the book actually first time, similar age as Nico, when I was slightly older. I think it was like 21, and I was going through some challenges, and that book helped me a lot. And then I've actually also just been recently rereading it during the pandemic, and for the first time in 8 or 9 years. And I think his message is so important. One of the things I've started doing recently, or maybe a month ago, is this 5-minute journal. Nice. And in the 5-minute journal, it asks the daily affirmation. And one of the things that I have frequently been putting in there is that there is meaning in pain, there is meaning in suffering. And I think one of the things that we live in a society where we try to run from pain, and where we're conditioned to say sometimes good days or bad days, or that only that pain is a bad thing, right? So that take an Advil if you're feeling like you have a headache. And I think that it's really important to think about that every life there's pain and sort of suffering, and that in the concept there's of post-traumatic growth, of how people can overcome trauma or overcome pain. I think so much of it often is linked to that sense of trying to find some kind of meaning through extremely difficult circumstances. And there's few people who have gone through as intense of the challenging circumstances of Viktor Frankl and what he experienced in the Holocaust. And the book is incredibly inspiring. I will definitely check out Confederation of Dunces. I've not read that book, and it sounds like a great recommendation. Also, I think it's so important to write well. It requires reading a lot, and I think sometimes reading about writing is super helpful. One book I would recommend for our listeners to also check out is a book by Stephen King, who, as many people know, is a prolific writer and has written probably 30 or 40 different novels, probably the most successful novelist, or one of the most successful novelists of the last 30, 40 years. And he has a great book called On Writing, which really focuses on how does he write? And in particular, how does he write so prolifically? Like, he has a novel coming out every like 6 months. Because it also has a lot of tangible writing style, but just more of as a general approach to how do you actually prolifically write. And one of his main things that he recommends is the way you write a lot is you read a lot. And if you're going to be a great writer, you have to read omnivorously, and you have to read consistently. So those are really important books that Nico provides, and I think are fantastic recommendations. Nico, it has been an absolute pleasure chatting with you today. We've talked about a lot of different topics, including effective writing, the principles of product management, how to find a high potential startup if you're looking for employment, how to be effectively employee in a high growth company, the importance of kind of exercise for mental health, and in particular, how long distance athletics can be incredibly meditative. And of course, a lot of different book recommendations. So it's been a true pleasure. Thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Likewise. Thanks, Scott. It's been a pleasure.
That's it for this week's episode of A New Wave of Entrepreneurship. Stay connected with us via our social and our email list. Subscribe to us in your favorite podcast app so that you don't miss our next episode. If you have feedback on today's episode, tweet us at Venture4Canada. That is Venture, the number 4, Canada, or email us at podcast@venture4, that's spelled FOR, Canada.ca. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks for listening. I'm Scott Stewart, and until next time, stay safe, stay motivated, and stay grateful. A New Wave of Entrepreneurship is produced by Juanita Lee Garcia and Latifa Farah. Editing and mixing also done by Latifa Farah. Erica Ormanston is our editorial assistant. Mark Wallach and Premium Beat own the copyright and publishing rights related to the song used in this podcast. The comments and opinions, recommendations, or suggestions expressed on the podcast by the guests are not liable to Venture for Canada and belong solely to each individual. Any information provided stated by our guests and our host is independent of Venture for Canada. A New Wave of Entrepreneurship is a Venture for Canada brand, and all content is owned by Venture for Canada. If you'd like to use our content, please reach out to us at podcast@venture4, that's spelled FOR, Canada.ca.